Hey guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into a painter's studio that smells faintly of linseed oil, candle smoke, and, well, death. You probably won't survive this one, not because it's dangerous, but because once you learn what your favorite art museums are hiding inside their most peaceful portraits, you'll never quite look at that lovely shade of brown the same way again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in London. The year is somewhere around 1830, though it could just as easily be Paris, Florence, or Vienna. Every city that breathes oil paint smells the same. Dust, turpentine, and old dreams. The room you're standing in is a studio. Not grand, but alive. The kind of place where creative chaos makes sense to exactly one person. And right now, that person isn't here. Canvases lean like tired soldiers against the walls. Brushes bristle from cracked jars. Half-mixed pigments rest on a wooden palette that's seen better centuries. And there, near the light of a high, grimy window, sits a small ceramic pot. The label reads, Mumia. You blink. You think it's a joke. It's not. You lift the lid and instantly regret it. The scent hits you first. Dust and resin, with something faintly organic beneath. It's earthy in a way dirt never quite manages. Inside is a soft, reddish-brown powder, the kind that would mix beautifully with oil and whisper warmth into a painting. And that's when the story begins. Because mummia, or mummy brown, was not a metaphor. It was exactly what it sounded like: ground-up Egyptian mummies. For nearly 4 centuries, European painters mixed the preserved flesh of the long dead into their palettes. It wasn't a rumor, it was a business, an entire trade built on stolen tombs and misunderstood medicine. A mainstream fact: the pigment was derived from both human and feline mummies exported from Egypt, sometimes mixed with bitumen and myrrh. It produced a warm, translucent brown, perfect for glazing shadows. A fringe tidbit: apothecaries once sold powdered mummy as a medicine, believing it cured everything from bruises to internal bleeding. When it stopped being swallowed, artists started spreading it on canvas. Progress of a sort. Historians still argue whether most painters actually knew what they were using, or if they preferred not to ask questions about why their browns were so lifelike. You dip your finger in the dust. It clings like ash, smooth, fine, ancient. You look at a half-finished portrait on the easel, its eyes staring back in quiet judgment, and realize the color of its skin tone matches the powder in your hand. Maybe coincidence, maybe not. The painter will be back soon. You should probably leave. But part of you can't. Because suddenly you're thinking about the people who became this color. The kings, the mothers, the cats curled beside them in death. Once sacred, now smeared thin across European art. The wind outside catches the edge of a curtain. Light falls differently now. Dust motes, swirling like spirits disturbed. Somewhere, a clock ticks. You set the jar down, gently. You whisper, half joke, half apology. Sorry for borrowing your cheekbones. And in the quiet that follows, the studio feels less like a place of creation and more like a tomb with better ventilation. The door creaks as you step further inside. Not loudly, just enough to remind you this studio is older than most secrets. You're not alone, at least not spiritually. Every wooden beam overhead, every worn floorboard beneath your shoes seems to remember centuries of brush strokes, spilled varnish, and the quiet arguments artists have with themselves. You drift past an easel where a half-finished portrait watches you with half-dried eyes. There's something unsettling about it, not the expression, but the skin tone. Warm, subtle, too real. You already know the answer. Because by now, you've figured it out. That soft brown glow, it's mummy. Not mummy like your mother, not even mummy like Halloween decorations. We're talking actual embalmed ancient Egyptians. Their bones, their resin-soaked flesh, all ground down into fine powder and sold by the ounce. Mainstream fact. For centuries, people honestly believed mummy had healing powers. It started in medicine before it made its way into art. Early pharmacists, apothecaries, sold it as a kind of catch-all remedy. Toothache? Try some powdered farro. Sore muscles? Maybe a priest's shin bone will help. You think Tylenol has weird side effects? But here's the kicker. Artists weren't just complicit, they were customers. Mummy Brown was loved, celebrated, admired. It glazed the shadows of Rembrandt, warmed the cheeks of Victorian portraiture, and gave death a second career as a highlight pigment. Fringe tidbit? Some jars labeled mumia also contained feline mummies. Cats, sacred in Egypt, found themselves exported posthumously to France and England, not to be worshipped, but to be mixed with linseed oil. Imagine trying to explain that to Bastet. Historians still argue whether the artists truly believed the origin stories. Some claim the pigment was so commercialized, so normalized, that few thought twice. Others suggest denial, convenient ignorance wrapped in a warm brown glaze. You bend down to look inside another jar. Not mumia this time, just raw sienna. Funny how normal that feels now. The jar beside it? Bone black. Yeah, that's exactly what it sounds like. Crushed animal bones, charred and powdered. You wonder who decided this was all okay. Who looked at a tomb, a sarcophagus, a ceremonial burial meant to last eternity, and thought, you know what this would be perfect for? Eyeliner. Or a landscape. But then the past is full of repurposing. Temples become churches. Palaces become prisons. Gods become pigments. A shaft of light cuts across the room, catching the corner of a canvas. There's a painting of a reclining nobleman, ruffled collar, loose jaw, a smirk that says he probably tipped poorly. You study his face, the brown in the shadow under his lip. Warm, familiar. You glance back
at the mumia jar. And you realize you've seen that shade before. On postcards, on museum walls, on the cover of the art history textbook you didn't read in college. It's been hiding in sight plain. You step closer to the painting, and for a moment, you swear it exhales. Not metaphorically, not figuratively. You hear it, the softest sigh, like dust being disturbed by memory. The curtain flutters again. Maybe it's the wind, maybe not. You step back. The studio, once vibrant, now feels reverent, less workshop, more chapel or morgue. You don't know what compels you to whisper again. Maybe guilt, maybe respect. "Thanks for the glow," you murmur. The portrait doesn't answer, but somewhere in the rafters, a pigeon coos like it's been listening the whole time.
You leave the studio, but not the feeling. The smell of dust and resin clings to your sleeve. The thought of powdered kings clings tighter to your mind. Outside, the city has changed, or maybe it's you. London, or Florence, or wherever your imagination has landed, feels muted now, like someone turned down the saturation on the entire street. You pass by an apothecary's shop. Its windows are fogged with age, the lettering peeling. "Ye olde remedies and paints." Inside, small glass vials line the shelves like soldiers waiting for battle. Some hold familiar things: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. Others, not so much. One bottle reads, "Pulvis Mumiae, finest Alexandria grade." You raise an eyebrow. Finest grade. Like coffee? Like wine? A mainstream fact. During the 17th and 18th centuries, mummified remains were ground and graded based on age, darkness, and purity. The best came from older, darker specimens, richer in bitumen and resin. Some traders even roasted the bodies to enhance color before grinding them down. You can't decide what's more horrifying, the fact itself or how nonchalantly it was cataloged. Behind the counter, the apothecary stirs something thick and brown. You don't ask what it is. Fringe tidbit. Forgeries were common. Some enterprising vendors faked mummy powder using bits of asphalt, animal bones, or unclaimed corpses from battlefields, a kind of counterfeit corpse commerce. Historians still argue whether artists preferred the authentic stuff or just bought whatever gave them that rich caramel glaze they liked for skin tones. The bell above the door jingles as you back out of the shop. You need air. Down an alley, you find a wall mural, peeling, fading, but still defiant. A woman in profile, hand raised, palm painted in that same warm brown. The signature is smudged, or maybe lost. You reach out to touch it, but stop just short. It feels sacred now. You think again of the bodies, wrapped in linen, buried with ceremony, prayers in ink on papyrus scrolls, the belief that their ka, their soul, would journey beyond the stars, guided by gods and guarded by cats. Instead, they wound up here, in shops, in brushes, in portraits of people they'd never meet. You wonder, is it worse to be forgotten or reused? The mural's gaze follows you as you walk away. Not accusing, just tired.
Your feet crunch over gravel as you round the corner. A pigeon coos above. Same one from the studio? Probably not, but you nod to it anyway. You stop outside a gallery. Velvet ropes, white walls, air-conditioned reverence. You walk inside. The first painting you see is enormous. Canvas stretched like skin, colors glowing under soft museum lights. There's that brown again. You step closer. A woman's cheekbone. A shadow under a ruffled collar. A perfectly rendered fur trim. The label reads, Portrait of Lady with a Falcon, circa 1827. No mention of what's in the paint. No nod to the bodies beneath. Of course not. You imagine slipping a note under the frame. This portrait was brought to you by Pharaoh's right scapula. You almost laugh. Almost.
You move through the gallery like a ghost, silent, slow, and full of questions you didn't bring in with you. Your fingers stay behind your back, polite museum pose, but your eyes linger on every warm shadow, every chestnut fold of painted fabric, every gentle blush of skin that might have come from a pharaoh's femur. A guard watches you from the corner. You give them a sleepy nod. They don't nod back. Mainstream fact. Most art museums still hold paintings created with mummy brown, but almost none of them advertise it. Conservationists have quietly cataloged dozens, sometimes scraping samples, sometimes just noting the date ranges. And yet, you won't find mummy origin on any plaques. It's a secret shared by paint. You pause before a smaller piece. Nothing grand, just a bowl of fruit. Peaches, figs, pomegranates. Their shadows melt into the background in that same warm brown. You check the date. 1815. You don't even bother checking the pigment list. You whisper, "Hello again," like you're greeting someone you keep bumping into on the subway. Fringe tidbit. When artists stopped using mummy as medicine, the leftover stock was often sold to painters on discount. There are 19th century letters complaining about the price of cadmium yellow going up, while mummy brown was still wonderfully affordable, like there was a clearance sale on the afterlife. Historians still argue whether artists ever painted their own portraits using the pigment. Some records suggest yes, others say it's too morbid to be real. You hope it's not true, then immediately hope it is. Because imagine that, brushing your own nose in mummy dust and knowing it. You step outside the gallery. The air feels sharp now, real. You blink up at the sky and wonder if it's always been that blue, or if it just feels brighter because you've spent the last hour swimming in shadows. At a corner stall, a street artist paints tourists for tips. You watch as they mix their colors with a plastic spoon. No mummies involved, just acrylics, cheap and cheerful. You exhale. There's progress, after all. But then you notice the postcard rack. One card shows a painting you just saw inside, The Lady with the Falcon. And printed neatly in the corner like it means nothing, Pigment, mummy brown. Well, at least someone told the truth. You buy the card. You don't know why. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's fascination.
Maybe it's because you now know what's in the color beneath her collarbone, and that kind of secret deserves a pocket. The artist hands you the change and says, "She's a beauty, isn't she?" You nod. She really is. Then you walk away before they say anything else. Because if they ask why, you won't know what to say.
You keep the postcard tucked into your coat pocket, like it might crumble. It doesn't, of course. It's not that old. But still, something about it feels fragile. Like memory, like ethics, like the thin line between honoring the dead and blending them into shadows for aesthetics. The museum is behind you now, but the story clings like the pigment on your fingers. A little sticky, a little sacred. You take the long way home. Mainstream historical fact. By the late 19th century, Mummy Brown was falling out of favor, not because of some grand ethical awakening, but because the supply chain was drying up. There are only so many mummies in the world, and after centuries of medical theft, tomb raiding, and pigment grinding, well, the inventory was getting thin. That's the official reason most records give: scarcity. A fringe tidbit: one of the most famous pigment manufacturers, Robertson & Co. in London, once received so many complaints about the quality of their mummy powder that they allowed artists to come and view the mummies being ground, like some kind of twisted open kitchen. A Victorian art supplier offering mummy viewings, for transparency. Historians still argue whether this was a PR move or just a very English attempt at customer service. You imagine the scene anyway. A group of artists, sipping weak tea, politely watching as someone chips a shin bone into a mortar and pestle. One whispers, "Do you think that's human?" Another shrugs, "Could be cat." You pass a bookstore and pause. Its window display features old tomes, gilded titles, cracked spines, that peculiar smell of knowledge that's lingered too long. You step inside. It's quiet, dim, and barely heated. The kind of shop that feels like it remembers more than it sells. You find the art history section and run your finger along the spines. So many names, so many schools. Impressionism, Baroque, Rococo. All those movements, all that paint, all those people who never knew, or pretended not to know, what gave their shadows warmth. You pull down a dusty volume, Pigments of the Old World. No price tag, just a small note tucked inside. Ask Gerald. You do. Gerald appears from nowhere, like a proper old bookshop cliché. He looks like he's been alphabetized at some point in his life. "Mummy Brown?" he says when you ask. He nods. Then, because apparently he's that kind of shopkeeper, he pulls out a tiny glass vial from a drawer behind the counter. It's sealed, labeled in cursive, and just barely tinted with something warm and reddish. "Not for sale," he says. "Of course," you reply. Because what would you even do with it? Smear it on canvas? Bury it again? You just hold it for a moment. Let the weight settle. Let the color speak. It says, "I used to be someone."
You set the vial down, thank Gerald, and leave the bookshop. Outside, the wind has picked up, cold and sharp and full of quiet reminders. And when you glance at your fingers, no paint, no dust, you swear they still look a little too warm.
You don't go straight home. Instead, your feet take you down side streets you haven't wandered in years. The kind with gas lamps that flicker even though they're electric now, and iron fences that hum quietly in the cold. You pass a church that smells like old hymns and mothballs, a bakery still open late with someone icing a cake like it's a religious rite. The world continues, oblivious to powdered mummies. Mainstream historical fact. Victorian society, despite all its frilly manners, was pretty obsessed with death. From mourning jewelry made with real hair to post-mortem photography to elaborate rituals of grief that spanned years. Death wasn't something to avoid. It was practically a side hustle, which might explain why Mummy Brown didn't raise eyebrows for so long. If you're already wearing Aunt Margaret's braided hair and a locket around your neck, painting with someone's grandma isn't that much of a leap. Fringe tidbit. Some European households reportedly kept small pieces of mummified remains as good luck charms. Especially in places where old beliefs clashed with new science, a dried hand or finger bone was considered both a curiosity and a protective talisman. Historians still argue whether these souvenirs were taken with reverence or just colonial entitlement wrapped in velvet. Either way, the pigment made its way into paintings that now hang in your favorite museums. Quiet masterpieces, glowing skin tones, perfectly shadowed folds of fabric. You imagine tourists admiring them, leaning in close, whispering, "How did they get the light just right?" And the answer, whispered back from the canvas, might be because the light is painted with darkness. You reach the river. It flows black tonight, slick with street light and memory. A boat glides silently beneath a bridge, its wake smearing stars across the water. You sit on the stone ledge for a while. Your fingers trace the cool curve of your coat button. You feel oddly grateful for the discomfort, the unease, the awareness. Because now when someone says, "Art lasts forever," you'll remember it's not always metaphor. Sometimes someone had to disappear so the portrait could remain. You exhale. The air fogs. You check your hands again. Still clean. But somewhere in your mind, you know you're carrying a new layer now, a dusty sepia truth. It will settle in your thoughts like a thin glaze, warm, translucent, impossible to scrub off. The painting has changed. You don't notice it at first, not until you glance back at the easel, the one near the window where that half-finished portrait rests, and realize the shadows under its eyes are deeper, browner, warmer. You step closer. The color has dried slightly since you last looked. It's richer now, more lifelike. You half expect the figure to blink. It doesn't, but you flinch anyway. Let's rewind a bit. It's 1842, and you're in Paris this time. Or maybe Munich. Wherever artists gather with brushes and ambition, you'll find the same smells. Hot wax, turpentine, fresh bread from a corner stall, and pigment. Always pigment. And somewhere in this maze of art and poverty and occasional genius, you find a merchant. He doesn't sell paint. He sells possibilities. Tiny paper-wrapped bundles, each marked in curling script: malachite, vermilion, cinnabar, and one labeled, inevitably, mummia. Mainstream fact: mummy brown was prized for its glazing ability. When layered over other pigments, it gave depth, like warm smoke behind cooler hues. Painters loved it for shadows, folds of fabric, and, disturbingly often, skin. Fringe tidbit? One manufacturer famously retired the pigment in the 1960s because, this is real, they finally ran out of mummies. No supply, no color. Historians still argue whether the demand for mummia ever significantly impacted actual archaeological sites. Some say it accelerated looting. Others claim it was just a weird sideshow in a much bigger imperial circus. You stare again at the portrait. The cheekbones sharp, the hollows beneath delicately brown. You swear they weren't that defined before. Maybe it's the light. Maybe it's your imagination. Or maybe the painting is remembering something. You glance over at the palette. The brown smudge there seems darker now, thicker. You touch it, just once. It's cold. You look back up, and for the briefest moment, you're not sure the eyes in the painting haven't shifted slightly left. You blink. They haven't. You really need to stop working this late.
You're not sure when the rain started. It's soft, more suggestion than weather, just enough to make the window glass sigh and blur. You've stayed in the studio longer than you meant to, hovering near that strange little pot of pigment, wondering how long it's been since anyone noticed it sitting there. But now, your attention shifts to the painting beside it. It's a portrait, mid-size, unfinished. The sitter's eyes are done, but the hands are still just sketches. One sleeve is perfect, the other a vague wash of burnt umber and shadows. But it's the face that holds you. Because now that you've read the label on the jar, it's impossible not to see it differently. The cheekbones, that slight, soft brown glaze in the hollows under the eyes. It's not just color anymore. It's context. You're not looking at a woman in profile. You're looking at someone painted with someone. And you wonder, absurdly, who would haunt whom more? The dead embalmed in paint? Or the living now immortalized using them? By the early 1800s, mummy brown had hit peak popularity in Europe. Not just for portraits either. Landscape painters used it to add warmth to soil and depth to twilight skies. Some artists even layered it over reds and yellows to simulate the look of old parchment or glowing firelight. Mainstream fact: Sir Edward Burne-Jones, a respected pre-Raphaelite painter, was said to have buried his remaining tube of mummy brown after learning its source. A small symbolic funeral. No headstone. Fringe tidbit. Some tubes of the pigment contained actual bandage fibers, not just the powdered remains, cloth too. A few unlucky artists reported finding tiny bone fragments mixed in, like the world's most morbid Easter egg. Historians still argue whether the pigment's use was driven more by novelty or convenience. Some claim it was just a phase, a quirky footnote in the long history of art supplies. Others insist it was an open secret, a morally flexible way to channel the mystique of the East into the aesthetics of the West. You run your hand along the edge of the canvas frame. There's a fingerprint in the paint, dried now, but permanent. Maybe the painter's, maybe the apprentice's, maybe someone else's entirely. You imagine being that apprentice, tasked with mixing colors, sweeping floors, maybe grinding pigments. You're told to open a packet labeled mummia and mash it into oil until it's smooth. You might ask what it is. You might not. You might have already learned not to ask too many questions. In the other hand, the artist holds a brush made of squirrel hair, dipped in the pulverized past. They touch it to the canvas and turn flesh into art. And suddenly, you realize there's a kind of time travel happening here, a communion of centuries. One body dies in ancient Egypt, another is painted in Victorian England, and somehow both are preserved. Not in amber, but in brush strokes. The cat meows again. You forgot it was here. It curls around the door frame, flicks its tail, and stares at you like it knows secrets. Maybe it does. After all, Egyptians once revered cats, gave them jewelry, buried them with honor. And now, even they ended up in pigment jars. You murmur to the cat, "You'd never let them grind you up, right?" It blinks slowly, non-committal. You sit down in the old wooden chair near the fireplace, careful not to disturb the pile of folded rags on the seat. One smells faintly of linseed and lavender. Another, darker, has a coppery scent you decide not to investigate. A breeze rattles the window. For a moment, you swear you hear voices outside. Not English, not modern, just echoes, as if someone long gone is telling their side of the story. You wonder how many museums still carry these silent witnesses on their walls. How many curators know or care that a warm brown glaze was once a body. That art history is sometimes just regular history that no one thought to bury properly. You look again at the portrait. The woman's eyes are kind. You hope she never finds out.
You're not exactly sure what time it is, but the candle has burned low, and the shadows in the studio now stretch farther than they should. You glance again at the mummia jar. It's still where you left it, closed, quiet. But it feels heavier now, like it's listening. You pace once, slowly, across the wooden floor, and your heel catches on a crack. You nearly trip, then mutter under your breath some clumsy apology to no one in particular. Except, of course, you're not alone. Not exactly. The painter has returned, though not in the way you'd expect. He steps into the room like a ghost in reverse,
fading into reality rather than out. Not that he's dead. He's just one of those people whose presence takes a few moments to notice. Lean, quiet, nose smeared with ochre. He raises an eyebrow at you like you're the strange part of the evening. You nod to the jar. Is that really what I think it is? He snorts. Depends on how much you know. That's not comforting. And yet he doesn't hesitate. He walks over, opens the jar with one hand, dips a brush, and mixes the powder into a swirl of oil and turpentine. Look, he says, I didn't dig them up. I just make them beautiful again. You wince. By painting sunsets with their rib cages? He shrugs. They're dead either way. A historical fact. By the 19th century, mummy brown was available from major European pigment merchants, often labeled simply as caput mortuum, Latin for deadhead. Not exactly subtle. A fringe tidbit. Some artists refused to use it on moral grounds, especially after learning what it was made of. Others requested proper burial for leftover pigment. There are even records of ceremonial reburials for mummy-based paint. Art Guilt, 1800s style. Historians still argue, the painter muses aloud, whether it was more about convenience or reverence. He dabs a brush into a canvas's shadowed fold of fabric. Personally, I think it's the same thing. You try to respond, but your voice sticks. Maybe it's the fumes. Maybe it's something else. Because now you're staring at that painting again, the one with the strange warmth in the shadows, the one with the half-smile that's too subtle for the living. And you wonder, how many stories are trapped inside that pigment? How many whispers dried into dust? And if you listen long enough, would you hear one? You inch closer to the canvas. You could swear its eyes shift. But when you blink, they're still. Still watching.
The painter's brush still dances, and the room now smells faintly of rosemary and rosin, his own little addition to the old world mix. You're not sure what's more unnerving, that he works with such ease, or that you're getting used to the idea of painting with powdered ancestors. Outside, bells chime. Probably St. Pancras. Probably time to go. But you don't move. You keep staring at that portrait. The shadows, the light, the unmistakable warmth of the figure's skin, like they're barely separated from your world by a sheet of varnish. And suddenly, you have a question. What if it's haunted? The painter snorts again. Haunted. It's paint, not a seance. But then, without looking up, he adds, though some canvases do hum, quiet-like, only at night. You glance toward the shelves where other works lean, each one a silent story layered in oils and resins. You wonder how many layers are literal.
Here's a mainstream fact. In addition to mummy pigment, artists of the 18th and 19th centuries used other organic materials: crushed insects for crimson, cochineal, ox gall for flow control, and even cow urine to brighten yellow. A canvas back then was basically a farmyard resume. A fringe tidbit? Some say pre-Raphaelite painters believed mummy brown helped bring a soulful melancholy to their figures. Whether superstition or just chemical warmth, the story stuck. And yet, historians still argue whether artists who painted with such materials ever truly understood or wanted to understand the colonial pipelines that delivered them. Egypt wasn't just exotic, it was exploited, revered and raided in equal measure. You run your fingers along a wooden frame. There's a tiny nick where the paint has chipped. Beneath the layers, you swear the underpainting looks almost bruised. The painter finally stops. He wipes his brush, glances sideways. "You know," he says, almost fondly, "some of them asked to be remembered this way." "Who?" "The dead." You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. "Or maybe I just tell myself that so I can sleep." You consider this. Then you whisper, "Does it help?" A beat. No. And with that, he lights another candle and turns away, his silhouette dancing on the cracked plaster wall like a shadow from another century. You step back toward the jar, just one last look, but this time you don't open it. You just listen. And in the silence, you could almost swear something stirs.
Later, maybe minutes, maybe hours, you find yourself wandering the streets. London's gas lamps haloed in mist like tired fireflies. Cobblestones glisten with the memory of rain. You should be heading home, but your feet don't agree. They're leading you somewhere, though you're not entirely sure where. Eventually, you land in front of a storefront. It's narrow, tucked between a glove shop and a butcher's that smells aggressively like liver. The sign above the door reads, "Harcourt and Sons, Pigments and Curiosities." Of course. A bell tinkles overhead as you step inside. Dusty shelves stretch floor to ceiling, stacked with glass jars and tins, each labeled with elegant, spidery script. It's the kind of place where time forgets how to tick. Behind the counter, an elderly man blinks at you over half-moon spectacles. He looks like he hasn't moved since the last eclipse. Looking for something in particular? You hesitate. Then, "Mummia." His expression doesn't change, just the faintest tightening around the eyes. "Painter." "No," you say. "Tourist." That gets a chuckle. He shuffles to a back shelf and retrieves a small jar. Same label, same powder, but this one's darker, almost burnt umber. "Mummia," he confirms, tapping the glass. "Older batch,
might still be a pharaoh in there. You laugh nervously, but he doesn't. Mainstream fact: by the mid-1800s, Egyptomania had reached its peak. Napoleon's campaigns, the Rosetta Stone, and traveling mummy exhibitions meant Egyptian artifacts were being consumed not just by scholars, but by the public, and occasionally by their pets. Fringe tidbit: some Victorian families reportedly unwrapped mummies at dinner parties. The practice, called mummy unrollings, was equal parts spectacle, science, and societal horror. The powder left behind? Often sold in shops like this one. Historians still argue whether this widespread desecration was driven more by curiosity, racism, or just the total lack of Netflix. You hold the jar. Feel its weight. It's heavier than you expect, denser somehow, like it knows what it is. The old man watches you. They say, he murmurs, that once you paint with this stuff, the subject never quite looks away. You set the jar back a little too quickly. I think I'm just browsing. No one ever just browses pigment, he says, but he lets you wander. As you leave, the bell chimes again. The air outside smells cleaner, but your hands still feel dusty. And somewhere deep in your pocket, you realize you've absent-mindedly taken something with you. A flake. Tiny. Brown. Warm.
You try to sleep that night. You really do. But your mind keeps circling back to that jar, the old man's voice, the portrait in the studio with skin the color of regret. And maybe it's the candlelight dancing on your walls, or maybe it's something deeper, but you start to see faces. Not ghosts exactly, just expressions. Eyebrows frozen mid-concern, eyes that seem to follow you, cheekbones sharpened by centuries of sun, now reduced to pigment and politely brushed onto cherubs and saints. Somewhere in your half-dream, a voice mutters, "We were sacred once." Mainstream fact: ancient Egyptians believed preservation of the body was essential to the soul's journey after death. Organs were removed, bodies salted, then wrapped in linen and buried with amulets and prayers. These weren't corpses, they were cosmic passports. Quirky tidbit: some embalmers included onions stuffed into eye sockets and under armpits. Why onions? Maybe deodorant? Maybe symbolism. Maybe they just hated bland mummies. No one's quite sure. Historians still argue whether the exportation of mummies in the 16th to 19th centuries was driven more by colonial economics or Enlightenment-era pseudoscience. Either way, by the time you paint a saint with powdered king, someone's lost the plot. You wake with a start. Your room is dark, but not silent. There's a soft rustle near the window, then a thud. You sit up, slowly. The street lamp outside casts a faint golden glow through the curtain. And then, blink, and you see it. A paw print, small, precise, on your windowsill, and another on your desk, brownish red, dusty, impossible. You rub your eyes. It's gone. but the faint scent of myrrh and turpentine still lingers. You exhale hard. "Okay," you whisper, to no one in particular, but even as you say it, you glance at your coat, the pocket. You reach inside, and there it is, that single flake, warmer than it should be, slightly sticky. You throw it in the bin, or at least you try, but the trash can is empty when you check again the next morning, and on your pillow, just the faintest trace of paw dust.
You go about your day like normal. Mostly. You make tea. You open a window. You tell yourself that the faint musky scent wafting through the air is just old varnish or city dust, or maybe your neighbor's weird new incense. But you also find yourself Googling terms like mummy brown side effects, haunted art materials, and how to tell if your apartment is cursed by a pigment. Mainstream fact? The use of mummy brown peaked in the 18th and 19th centuries, prized by pre-Raphaelite painters like Edward Burne-Jones. He reportedly stopped using it after discovering what it was made of, ceremonially burying the remaining pigment in his garden. Yes, really. Fringe tidbit? Some people claimed mummy brown had life energy because it came from preserved bodies. They believed paintings made with it held unusual warmth, or, less romantically, they just didn't dry properly. Historians still argue whether art dealers were honest about the origins of the pigment. Some labeled it caput mortuum, meaning dead head. Others avoided specifics entirely. Buyers may have known, but willful ignorance is easier when the results are pretty. You head to a museum, hoping to clear your mind. The galleries are calm, cool, marble and silence, but the portraits feel sharper. That 17th century Madonna, with the gentle shadows on her veil, why do you suddenly feel like she's watching you a little too closely? That Rembrandt etching, how did he capture such warmth in the cheeks? You pause before a 19th century allegorical painting titled "Time Devours All." A robed figure stares upward, flanked by crumbling tombs. The browns in the sky have a depth that feels familiar. You lean in, you squint, and you see it. Barely visible in the corner, a faded inscription painted in near invisible script. One word: Mumia. You shiver. Not because it's cold, because the color is looking back.
You sit on a museum bench, trying to clear your mind. Maybe you're overthinking. Maybe this is just sleep deprivation or too many true crime podcasts at night. But the silence isn't helping. Because silence in an old museum is never truly silent. It creaks. It breathes. It remembers. You watch a group of school kids pass a landscape painting. One boy whispers, "That tree looks like it's watching me." You want to laugh, but you can't quite manage it. Mainstream fact: Mummy brown
faded in popularity by the early 20th century, as supply dwindled and public distaste grew. By the 1960s, most manufacturers had quietly dropped mummy brown, though some offered synthetic versions made from resin and modern dyes. Fringe tidbit? A few last pigment jars were still sold under the name Mumia into the 1980s. They'd been sitting on shelves so long, no one remembered or wanted to remember what they contained. Historians still argue whether any original mummy pigment remains in circulation today. Some say no. Others whisper about mislabeled jars in private collections, auctioned away with no questions asked. You move on to the museum gift shop. You're not sure why. Maybe to feel grounded. Maybe to find a souvenir that doesn't involve ancient bones. You run your fingers along a row of colored pencils. Burnt umber, raw sienna, Venetian red. You hesitate. Mummy brown. The name's there, plain as day. Bold serif font on a modern label. You flip the box over. Ingredients: natural earth pigment, iron oxide. No mention of the dead, just the color. But you still wonder. Back home, you decide to paint. Just a small thing. A cat, maybe, curled in shadow. You mix a warm brown for the fur. It's perfect, rich, alive. You stare at the brush. You blink. And then, somewhere just beyond the edge of your hearing, you swear you hear a soft purring. The brush glides across the canvas in slow, steady strokes. You try not to think about pigment, or people, or pyramids. But that's the problem with history. It doesn't like to be forgotten, especially not when it's been ground, bottled, and smeared into every masterpiece hanging in every quiet corridor of European art. And now that you know, you can't not see it. The quiet faces in old portraits, their warm, glowing skin tones, the eerie vibrancy in those shadows. You wonder how many of them were painted using the very bodies of people long mourned, long sealed away. You pause, mid-stroke, and look out the window. It's raining. Of course it is. Mainstream fact. When the Victorian fascination with Egyptology hit full swing, it wasn't just painters who plundered the past. Tourists held mummy unwrapping parties, peeling back ancient linens like novelty gifts. Even royalty attended. No one batted an eye. Fringe tidbit. In one infamous incident, a train delay in London forced porters to unload cargo, including a poorly wrapped mummy. The crowd gathered. A boy tried to take the skull as a souvenir. The station master was not amused. Historians still argue whether the rise of synthetic pigments truly ended the mummification of art, or if the practice merely faded into less obvious forms. Some point to other questionable materials in modern use. Others suggest that true closure came not from innovation,
but from disgust. And now, here you are, trying to paint without ghosts, but realizing maybe, just maybe, the ghost is the point. Because every color has a story. Some just whisper louder. You rinse the brush, turn off the light, and leave the painting half finished. That feels right. Outside, the wind picks up. You hear it tapping against the window, like a finger from long ago. Not threatening, not angry, just present, watching, still.
So now you rest. The studio behind you, the jar closed, the story told. Let your shoulders ease a little. Let your breathing deepen just a bit. There's no more pigment, no more whispers, only quiet. Imagine the dusty sun filtering through linen curtains, a cat asleep on a warm sill, the scent of old wood and linseed oil curling like memory in the air. You're not in a museum anymore, not in a tomb. You're in a space between, somewhere gentle, somewhere still. The past, with all its strange customs and stranger colors, can rest now. You've heard it, you've honored it. That's enough. The paintings, they'll keep watching. That's what they do. But you get to sleep. Feel the weight of the blankets, the hush of your room, the hum of that old fan in the corner, like distant desert wind. You're safe, you're still, and just maybe, somewhere deep inside a brushstroke, someone thanks you for remembering. Good night, curious one. Dream soft and dream in color.